The coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but Richard Thornton didn't notice. He sat alone in the corner booth of Maggie's diner, his expensive suit looking out of place against the worn vinyl seats, his fingers scrolling through emails on his phone with the same mechanical precision he'd used for the past 30 years. The dinner rush had faded to a quiet hum, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over his graying temples. He didn't look up when the waitress refilled his cup for the third time, didn't acknowledge the kindness in her tired smile. He was too busy calculating quarterly projections to see the woman standing before him, her name tag reading Claire in simple block letters. But when he finally called for his check and she walked away, he had no idea she was about to leave him something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about success.
"Where are you watching from tonight?"
Richard had built an empire. Thornton Industries was worth billions, with office buildings in 12 countries and his name on the Forbes list for 15 consecutive years. But empires, he'd learned, demanded sacrifices. His marriage had ended 8 years ago, a quiet dissolution marked by signatures on legal documents and the absence of arguments. Margaret had simply said she couldn't compete with spreadsheets anymore, and he'd let her go without much of a fight. His daughter, Amy, was 26 now, living somewhere in Seattle, working at a non-profit he didn't quite understand. They exchanged texts on birthdays and Christmas, brief messages that felt more like obligations than connections. Tonight was his 62nd birthday, and he'd spent it the same way he spent most evenings, working through dinner at whatever restaurant was closest to his Manhattan office. Maggie's diner wasn't his usual choice. His assistant had called in sick, hadn't made his reservation at the steakhouse where the servers knew to seat him away from the windows and bring his whiskey neat. So he'd walked into this small place with its checkered floors and the smell of home cooking, sat down without really seeing it, and ordered the meatloaf special because it was the first thing on the menu. Claire Martinez had been working the evening shift for 6 years. At 37, she'd lived enough life to recognize certain types of people the moment they walked through the door. She'd seen men like Richard before, though usually not in a place like Maggie's. They wore their wealth like armor, and their loneliness like shadows. She'd watched him for the past hour, this man who never looked up from his phone, who ate without tasting, who existed in a bubble so thick that the world around him might as well have been invisible. She'd been a nurse once, back before her husband Danny got sick. Multiple sclerosis had stolen him slowly, one function at a time, until the medical bills stole everything else. The house, the savings, the future they'd planned. When he passed 3 years ago, she'd been left with debt and memories and a daughter to raise. 17-year-old Sophie was smart as a whip, had dreams of becoming a doctor herself. Claire worked 2 jobs to make those dreams possible, waitressing at Maggie's and cleaning offices on weekends. She was tired in her bones, but she'd learned something through it all. She'd learned to see people, really see them, in ways she never had before. Richard finally glanced up when she brought the check. His eyes were a pale blue, intelligent but distant, the eyes of someone who'd stopped looking at the world and started looking through it. "Thank you," he said, the words automatic and empty. He pulled out his wallet, extracted a credit card without checking the bill, and handed it to her with barely a glance. Claire took the card and walked to the register, her heart doing something unexpected. She felt a tug of recognition, not of his face but of his emptiness. She'd seen that same hollow look in the mirror during the worst days of Danny's illness, when she'd been so consumed by survival that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be alive. The difference was, she'd found her way back. This man, she suspected, had been lost for far longer. When she ran his card and printed the receipt, she stood there for a long moment, pen in hand. The diner was nearly empty now, just old Mr. Henderson reading his paper at the counter and a young couple sharing a slice of pie. She could hear the dishwasher clanking in the kitchen, Maggie humming along to the radio. Claire looked down at the receipt, at the total of $18.43, and she did something she'd never done before. On the signature line, before bringing it back to his table, she wrote 6 words that came from somewhere deep and true. She set the receipt folder in front of him with a quiet, "Have a good evening." And this time, when she smiled, there was something in it that made him pause. He opened the folder, signed without looking, and started to stand. Then he froze. His eyes, those distant blue eyes, suddenly focused on the words she'd written beneath the tip line. Claire was already walking away, her heart pounding, wondering if she'd overstepped, if she'd made a terrible mistake. She didn't see his face go pale, didn't see his hand start to shake as he read those 6 words again and again. Richard sat back down, his legs suddenly unsteady. The words on the receipt seemed to burn into his vision. Your daughter looks just like you. That was all. 6 simple words that shouldn't have meant anything, couldn't have meant anything, because this waitress didn't know him, didn't know Amy, had never seen them together. But somehow, impossibly, they struck him like a physical blow. He looked up, searching for Claire, but she disappeared into the kitchen. His mind raced through the evening, trying to make sense of it. He hadn't mentioned his daughter. He'd barely spoken at all. How could she know? More importantly, why did those words make his chest tighten and his eyes burn with tears he hadn't shed in years? The truth was simpler and more painful than he could have imagined. Earlier that evening, before he'd even entered the diner, Amy had posted something on social media. Richard didn't use those platforms, considered them a waste of time, but Amy had tagged him in a photo. It was an old picture, one he'd forgotten existed, taken 23 years ago at a park. He was holding 5-year-old Amy on his shoulders, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. She'd captioned it, "Happy birthday, Dad. Remember when you used to smile?" I miss that version of you. Claire had seen it. She'd been on her break, scrolling through her phone to check on Sophie, when the post appeared. She followed several business pages, interested in success stories that might inspire her daughter, and Richard's name was tagged clearly. The photo had struck her immediately. The resemblance between father and daughter was remarkable. The same strong jaw, the same intense eyes, even the same slightly crooked smile. But what broke her heart was the caption, and the fact that this man who'd just sat in her section for an hour looked nothing like the joyful father in that old photograph. Richard didn't know any of this yet. All he knew was that a stranger had somehow seen through him, had written something that made him feel seen for the first time in years. He stood again, left $200 bills on the table with the signed receipt, and walked to the kitchen door. Maggie, a stout woman in her 60s with flour on her apron, looked up in surprise. "Can I help you, hon?" "The waitress, Claire, is she still here?" "She's just changing out of her uniform. She's got to get to her other job." Maggie studied him with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 40 years reading people. "You want to thank her for something?" "I want to ask her something." Maggie called through the back door, and a moment later, Claire emerged, now wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Up close, Richard could see the lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the strength in her shoulders, the wariness in her expression. She was beautiful in a way he'd stopped noticing in people, beautiful in her authenticity and her weariness and her quiet dignity. "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice rougher than intended. "How did you know about my daughter?" Claire's face softened with understanding, and she pulled out her phone, showing him the post. "I saw this during my break. I shouldn't have said anything. I'm sorry if I overstepped." Richard stared at the screen, at the image of who he used to be, at Amy's words that he hadn't even known existed. Something inside him cracked, a fissure in the armor he'd worn for so long. "She posted this today?" "About an hour before you came in." Claire hesitated, then added gently, "She misses you." "That much is clear." "I don't know how to be that person anymore," Richard said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "I don't know when I stopped being him." "Maybe that's something you could ask her," Claire suggested. "Maybe she remembers better than you do." They stood there in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room. This unlikely pair, while Maggie pretended to be busy wiping down counters and absolutely wasn't eavesdropping. Richard felt something shifting inside him, something that had been frozen beginning to thaw. It hurt. God, it hurt more than he'd expected. "Why did you write that?" he asked. "Why did you care?" Claire's eyes met his, and in them he saw a depth of understanding that made him feel simultaneously exposed and safe. Because I know what it's like to be so buried in survival that you forget to live. And I know what it's like to lose someone you love without ever meaning to." She paused, then added, "Your daughter is still here, still reaching out. Don't wait until it's too late to reach back. If those words touch something in your heart, if you've ever felt that distance from someone you love, please give this story a thumbs up." Sometimes we all need a reminder to hold on to the people who matter. Richard left the diner that night carrying more than just a receipt. He carried the weight of recognition, the burden of years of choices that had seemed right at the time, but had cost him everything that actually mattered. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, staring at that old photo of himself and Amy, trying to remember what it felt like to be that happy, that present, that alive. Finally, his fingers shaking, he did something he hadn't done in over a year. He called his daughter's number. It rang 4 times. He almost hung up, almost convinced himself this was a mistake. Then Amy's voice came through, cautious and surprised. "Dad?" "I saw your post," Richard said, and his voice broke on the words. "Amy, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." On the other end of the line, in her small apartment in Seattle, Amy sat down hard on her couch, tears already streaming down her face, and said the 3 words he'd needed to hear for years. "I'm here." "Dad." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Richard sat in his parked car outside Maggie's diner while the city moved around him, and for the first time in years, he listened more than he talked. Amy told him about her life, the nonprofit where she worked helping homeless families find housing, the boyfriend named Marcus, who taught high school English and made her laugh. She told him about the times she'd wanted to call but convinced herself he was too busy, too distant, too far gone. She told him, her voice shaking, about the day she'd realized she'd started thinking of him as an obligation rather than a father. "I used to make excuses for you," Amy said quietly. "Mom would be upset that you missed another recital, another graduation, another Christmas, and I'd tell her you were building something important. But Dad, I don't even know what you were building anymore. Was it worth it? Was any of it worth losing us?" Richard had no answer that didn't sound like a justification or an excuse. The truth was he didn't know. He'd told himself for years that he was doing it for them, providing for his family, securing their future. But Margaret had never cared about the money, and Amy had needed a father, not a bank account. Somewhere along the way, work had stopped being a means to an end and had become the end itself. He'd climbed and climbed until he'd climbed so high he couldn't see the ground anymore. Couldn't remember why he'd started climbing in the first place. "I'm 62 years old, Richard said, his voice raw, "and I just realized I don't have anyone to call on my birthday except my assistant. I don't have friends. I don't have hobbies. I don't have anything except work and money and the apartment that feels like a hotel room. And tonight, a waitress I'd never met before saw through me in 5 minutes and cared enough to say something. A complete stranger showed me more grace than I've shown the people I love." There was a long silence. Then Amy said, "She sounds like a good person. She is. She lost her husband, works 2 jobs to support her daughter, and she still has the capacity to see past her own exhaustion to notice a broken old man eating meatloaf alone on his birthday." Richard laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "What does that say about me, Amy? What kind of person have I become?" "I think you're the kind of person who's realizing he wants to change," Amy said, and there was something in her voice that Richard recognized as hope, fragile and tentative but real. "That's a start, isn't it?" They made plans before they hung up. Amy would fly to New York the following weekend. They'd spend time together, real time, not the obligatory lunch that Richard would inevitably cut short for a meeting. He'd show her the parts of the city she'd never seen, the places he'd forgotten existed. They'd talk, really talk about the past and the possibility of a different future. When they finally said goodbye, Richard sat in the darkness of his car and cried for the first time since his own father's funeral 30 years ago. But the night wasn't over. Richard drove back to his apartment, a penthouse overlooking Central Park that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. It was beautiful in the way of magazine spreads, all modern furniture and expensive art, and nothing that suggested anyone actually lived there. He poured himself that whiskey he'd never ordered at dinner and stood at the window, looking out at the glittering city below. For years, this view had represented his success, proof that he'd made it. Tonight it just looked lonely. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. He opened it, expecting spam, and found instead a brief note. "This is Claire from the diner. Maggie gave me your number. I hope your conversation with your daughter went well. I'm sorry if I overstepped tonight. Sometimes I forget not everyone wants strangers meddling in their lives." Richard read the message 3 times, moved by the thoughtfulness of it, the gentle concern from someone who had no reason to care. He typed back, "You didn't overstep. You saved me. Thank you." Then, before he could second-guess himself, he added, "I'd like to do something for you to thank you properly. Would you let me help with your daughter's college expenses?" The response came quickly. "That's kind, but I can't accept that. I didn't write that note for money." "I know you didn't," Richard typed. "That's exactly why I want to help. Have you ever been in a position to help someone who desperately needed it, or been the one receiving unexpected kindness? Share your experience in the comments below. These moments remind us that we're all connected in ways we don't always see." Claire's response took longer this time. When it came, it was more thoughtful. "I appreciate the offer more than you know, but I've learned that I need to do this myself. It's not about pride. It's about knowing I can, about showing my daughter that you don't give up on your dreams no matter how hard it gets. The best thing you can do for me is whatever you promised your daughter tonight. Don't waste the second chance you've been given." Richard looked at those words for a long time, humbled by this woman who had so little but understood so much. She was right, of course. The help she needed wasn't financial. What she'd given him tonight was worth more than money could ever repay, and she knew it. She'd given him back his daughter, his future, maybe even himself. The following week passed differently than any Richard could remember in years. He called Amy every night, sometimes just to say hello, sometimes to share a memory she'd thought he'd forgotten. He learned that he actually hadn't forgotten anything, had just buried it all beneath layers of work and ambition, and the belief that feelings were inefficient. He remembered her first day of kindergarten, how she'd turned back at the classroom door to wave at him with such trust and joy. He remembered teaching her to ride a bike in Riverside Park, how she'd skinned her knee and he'd carried her home on his shoulders while she sang silly songs to make herself feel better. He remembered all of it, and the remembering hurt and healed in equal measure. He also thought about Claire constantly. Her quiet strength had stayed with him, the way she'd seen right through his expensive suit to the lonely man underneath. On Thursday, he found himself walking past Maggie's diner during his lunch hour. He didn't go in, just stood across the street watching through the window. Claire was working the lunch rush, moving between tables. With practiced efficiency, her smile genuine even when she looked exhausted. He saw her laugh at something an elderly customer said, saw her ruffle a little boy's hair as she brought him chocolate milk. She was present with everyone, fully there, in a way Richard was just learning to be. That evening, Richard did something unprecedented. He left his office at 5 o'clock. His assistant, who'd returned from her sick leave, actually gasped. "Mr. Thornton, is everything all right?" "Actually," Richard said, and realized he meant it. "I think it might be." He went to a bookstore, something he hadn't done in decades. He bought books about parenting adult children, about healing family relationships, about finding meaning beyond success. The young clerk looked at him curiously, this man in an expensive suit buying self-help books with the intensity most people reserved for closing business deals. Richard didn't care. He was done caring what strangers thought, and ready to start caring about what mattered. Saturday came. Amy's flight landed at 2 in the afternoon. Richard was at the airport an hour early, pacing the arrivals area like an anxious teenager. When she finally emerged from the gate, he almost didn't recognize her. She'd cut her hair short, wore glasses he'd never seen, had his mother's smile that he'd forgotten she inherited. She spotted him and hesitated, as if unsure whether to hug him or shake his hand. Richard closed the distance and pulled her into an embrace, holding on perhaps too tightly, perhaps not tightly enough. "Hi." "Dad," Amy whispered against his shoulder, and he could hear the tears in her voice. The years of wanting this matched with the fear that it wouldn't be real. Wouldn't last. "Hi, sweetheart," he said back. And the word felt rusty but right. "I'm so glad you're here." They spent the afternoon doing simple things. Coffee at a cafe where Richard had never been. A walk through the park where autumn leaves painted the ground gold and crimson. Dinner at a small Italian restaurant where they shared pasta and stories and long silences that felt comfortable instead of awkward. Amy told him about her work, and instead of half listening while checking his phone, Richard listened with his whole attention. She described a family they'd helped last month, a mother with 3 kids who'd been living in their car. The organization had found them housing, connected them with resources, helped them rebuild. "It's not glamorous," Amy said, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "We don't make much money." But Dad, when that mother got the keys to her apartment and just stood there crying because her kids would have beds to sleep in, that meant something. That was real. "It sounds meaningful," Richard said, and he meant it. "It sounds like exactly what you should be doing." Amy looked at him with surprise and gratitude and something else he couldn't quite name. Later, he'd realize it was respect, something he'd lost from her years ago without noticing and was just beginning to earn back. On Sunday, Richard made a decision. He took Amy to Maggie's diner for breakfast. Claire was working, and when she saw them walk in together, her face broke into a smile that lit up the entire room. She seated them in a booth by the window, and Richard watched as she and Amy fell into easy conversation. 2 women who recognized kindness in each other. "So you're the one who wrote the note," Amy said, and there was no resentment in her voice, only wonder. "I hope I didn't cause any trouble," Claire replied. "You caused the best kind of trouble," Amy assured her, "the kind that wakes people up." If you've been moved by this journey, by a father and daughter finding their way back to each other, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Sometimes we all need reminders that it's never too late to change, never too late to reach for the love that's been waiting for us all along. Over pancakes and coffee, the 3 of them talked like old friends. Richard learned that Sophie, Claire's daughter, had been accepted to 3 colleges and was trying to decide between them. He learned that Claire's husband had been a firefighter before his illness, that they'd met at a community barbecue when they were both 22, that she still wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck. Amy and Claire exchanged numbers, promising to stay in touch, and Richard, watching these 2 remarkable women connect, felt something he'd almost forgotten existed, pure, uncomplicated gratitude. When the check came, Richard left a tip that would cover Sophie's first semester's tuition, along with a note of his own. "For the woman who taught a billionaire what wealth really means. This isn't charity. It's me learning to pass forward the gift you gave me. Let someone else help carry the load. You've earned it." Claire found the money and the note after they'd left, and she stood in the middle of the diner with tears streaming down her face while Maggie rubbed her back and told her it was about damn time something good happened to good people. The money would change her life, would give Sophie opportunities Claire had only dreamed of, but that wasn't what made her cry. It was the note, the understanding in those words, the recognition that accepting help wasn't weakness but wisdom. She'd spent 3 years believing she had to do everything alone, that independence meant isolation. Richard's note reminded her that we're meant to help each other, meant to hold each other up when the weight gets too heavy. That evening, Claire called Richard. "I can't possibly accept this," she said, but there was less conviction in her voice than before. "Yes, you can," Richard said gently. "Claire, you gave me back my daughter. You gave me back my life. Let me do this one thing. Let me be part of Sophie's future, the way you're part of mine and Amy's now." They talked for an hour, and by the end of it, Claire had agreed. But she made Richard promise something in return, that he'd keep showing up for Amy, keep building the relationship he'd let slip away, that he'd remember what it felt like to be truly wealthy, not in money, but in love and connection and presence. Richard promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The months that followed were a revelation. Richard cut his work hours by half, delegated tasks he'd always insisted only he could handle, discovered that the company ran just fine without his constant oversight. He and Amy had dinner every week, sometimes in New York, sometimes in Seattle, sometimes just over video chat when schedules didn't align. They worked through old wounds with patience and honesty, apologized for hurts given and received, built something new on the foundation of what had once been. Richard met Marcus, Amy's boyfriend, and liked him immediately for his easy laugh and the way he looked at Amy like she hung the moon. He attended one of the non-profit's fundraisers and wrote a substantial check, but more importantly, he volunteered.
He spent Tuesday evenings helping families fill out housing applications, using his business expertise in ways that actually mattered.
He learned the names of the people he helped, heard their stories, carried their hopes with him. He and Claire became genuine friends. She'd bring Sophie to the city to tour colleges, and they'd all meet for dinner. This unlikely family built on kindness and second chances. Sophie got into her first-choice school, and when Richard attended her high school graduation, sitting between Claire and Amy, he felt a fullness in his chest that no business deal had ever provided. He was part of something real, something that would outlast any quarterly earnings report or stock price. On the night before Sophie left for college, they all gathered at Maggie's diner. Even Margaret, Richard's ex-wife, joined them, and if there was awkwardness at first, it faded quickly into something almost comfortable. They'd all made mistakes, all lost their way, but they'd found it again. They toasted to new beginnings with coffee and milkshakes, and Maggie brought out a cake she'd made special, and Sophie cried happy tears while Claire held her close. Richard pulled out his wallet to pay the check, and inside he found the receipt from that night months ago, the one with Claire's note that had changed everything. He'd kept it, carried it with him as a reminder of the moment his life split into before and after. "Your daughter looks just like you." 6 words that had contained such profound wisdom. Not just the physical resemblance, but the recognition that he and Amy were meant to reflect each other, meant to see themselves in one another, meant to be connected in ways that money and success could never replace. "What are you thinking about?" Amy asked, noticing his distant expression. Richard showed her the receipt. "I'm thinking about the day a waitress saved my life with 6 words on a piece of paper." Claire smiled from across the table. "I think you saved your own life. I just turned on the light so you could see the door." "Then thank you for the light," Richard said. "Thank you for caring enough to see me when I'd forgotten how to see myself." They stayed until Maggie started stacking chairs on tables, laughing and talking and existing together in the way families do when they're real, when they're earned, when they're built on foundation stones of forgiveness and grace. When they finally left, walking out into the warm summer night, Richard put his arm around Amy's shoulders and she leaned into him, and it felt like coming home. The last thing Richard thought as he watched Sophie and Claire drive away toward their future, as he hugged Amy goodbye and promised to call tomorrow, as he walked back to his apartment that no longer felt empty, was that he'd spent his whole life chasing wealth and had finally discovered it in the most unexpected place. Not in bank accounts or stock portfolios or office buildings with his name on them, but in a note on a receipt, in a daughter's forgiveness, in a friendship born from kindness, in the understanding that being rich meant having people to love and being worthy of their love in return. He was 62 years old, and he was just learning how to live, but he was learning, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the relationships that matter most, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the beauty of second chances and the power of human connection. Thank you for being here, for listening, for caring. May you always have the courage to reach out when you've drifted too far, and the wisdom to recognize the moments that can change everything. Until next time, hold your loved ones close and remember, it's never too late to come home.